The Wyoming night was cold and crystal clear, with stars scattered across the black sky like salt spilled on a dark table. Sarah Mitchell sat by the window of her small cabin, wrapped in a wool blanket that had belonged to her mother, listening to a sound she had never heard before in her 18 years of life. Drums, distant but distinct, carrying across the sagebrush desert, with a rhythm that seemed both mournful and defiant, rising and falling like a heartbeat echoing through the wilderness. The sound made her skin prickle with an emotion she could not quite name, something between fear and fascination. Sarah had been living alone on the homestead for 8 months, ever since fever had taken both her parents within days of each other during the previous winter. She had considered leaving, traveling east to distant relatives who might take her in, but something about abandoning the land her parents had worked so hard to claim felt like a betrayal of their memory. So she had stayed, learning through trial and error how to maintain the property, tend the small garden, care for the few animals her parents had accumulated, and survive in isolation that was both liberating and terrifying in equal measure. The homestead sat in a valley between rocky hills covered with sagebrush and juniper, miles from the nearest neighbor and even farther from anything that could be called a town. Her father had chosen this remote location deliberately, wanting space and independence away from the complications of society. Sarah had inherited not just the land, but also his self-reliant spirit, though she sometimes wondered if self-reliance and loneliness were just different words for the same condition. The solitude had taught her to be observant and cautious, to notice details that might mean the difference between safety and danger in a landscape that was beautiful but unforgiving. The drums continued through most of the night, sometimes fading to barely audible, then returning stronger as if moved by wind or by the drummers themselves, traveling across the landscape. Sarah knew enough frontier history to understand that drums could mean many things: celebration, mourning, ceremony, or warning. The Shoshone and other tribes still moved through this territory, despite increasing pressure from settlers and the military, maintaining connections to lands that had been theirs long before any European had arrived. Sarah's parents had taught her to be wary of Native Americans, repeating stories of raids and conflicts, but they had also admitted they had never personally experienced any trouble in their years on the homestead. As dawn approached and the drums finally fell silent, Sarah dozed fitfully in her chair, too unsettled to return to bed. She woke fully when the first grey light began to seep through the window, accompanied by a sound that was distinctly closer and more immediate than the distant drums. It was the nervous whinnying of her horse in the small corral, a sound that usually meant something had disturbed the animal. Sarah grabbed the rifle her father had taught her to use and moved quietly to the door, her heart hammering with the heightened alertness that came from living alone and knowing that danger could arrive without warning. She opened the door slowly, scanning the area around the cabin with the systematic thoroughness her father had drilled into her. Everything appeared normal at first: the corral with her agitated horse, the small barn, the garden plot, the rough gate that marked the entrance to her property. But then Sarah saw something that made her freeze, her breath catching in her throat. Near the gate, collapsed on the ground, was a human figure, a man lying motionless, his body positioned in a way that suggested he had fallen there rather than chosen to rest. Sarah approached carefully, the rifle held ready but not pointed, her mind racing through possibilities. As she drew closer, details emerged that told a story even before she could see his face. The man was Native American, dressed in traditional Shoshone clothing that was torn and stained with dirt and blood. His hands were bound tightly behind his back, with rough rope that had cut into his wrists, leaving raw, bleeding marks. His long black hair was matted and tangled, and even from several feet away, Sarah could see bruises and cuts covering his exposed skin. He was breathing, but barely, his chest rising and falling in shallow movements that suggested severe exhaustion or injury. Sarah stood over the unconscious man, her mind torn between conflicting instincts and teachings. Everything she had been told about survival on the frontier screamed that this was dangerous, that helping him could bring his captors to her door, that she should protect herself first and worry about strangers second. But another voice, quieter but more insistent, reminded her of the values her parents had actually demonstrated rather than just preached, that suffering demanded response, that turning away from someone in desperate need was a betrayal of basic human decency. and that courage sometimes meant acting despite fear rather than because of its absence. The man's eyes flickered open briefly, unfocused and glassy with fever or pain, and in that moment Sarah made her decision. She could not leave him to die at her gate like an animal. She would bring him inside, tend his wounds, and deal with whatever consequences followed. Sarah set down her rifle and knelt beside the warrior, speaking softly even though she knew he probably could not understand her words. She told him she would help, that he was safe here, and that she needed him to try to work with her to get him inside the cabin where she could properly care for his injuries. The man was larger than Sarah and much heavier, making the task of moving him extraordinarily difficult. She cut the ropes binding his hands, wincing at the damage they had caused, then worked to get him into a position where she could drag him. It took nearly 20 minutes of exhausting effort, but she finally managed to get him through the door and onto the rough blankets she spread on the floor near the fireplace. His clothes were tattered and filthy, and when Sarah carefully removed his torn shirt to assess his injuries, she found extensive bruising, several deep cuts that would need cleaning and bandaging, and evidence of systematic beating that made her stomach turn with anger. Sarah worked through the morning, drawing water from the well, heating it over the fire, and cleaning the warrior's wounds with the same careful attention her mother had used when treating injuries. She applied poultices made from herbs her mother had taught her to identify and use, wrapped bandages around the worst cuts, and covered him with blankets to fight the fever she could feel burning through his skin. Throughout the process, the man remained mostly unconscious, occasionally groaning or muttering words in a language Sarah did not understand, but never fully waking or showing awareness of where he was or who was caring for him. As Sarah worked, she thought about the drums she had heard during the night. Had they been searching for this man? Were they his people, looking for a missing member of their band? Or had they been something else entirely, unrelated to the battered warrior now lying unconscious in her cabin? Sarah had no way to know, but she understood that by bringing him inside, she had committed herself to a course of action that could not be easily reversed. She had become responsible for his survival, and in doing so, had placed herself in a position that was both morally right and practically dangerous. By afternoon, Sarah had done everything she could for her unexpected patient. She prepared a simple broth, hoping he would wake enough to take some nourishment, and settled into a chair to keep watch. Outside, the Wyoming landscape continued its normal rhythms, wind moving through sagebrush, her horse finally calming in the corral, birds calling to each other across the valley. But inside the cabin everything had changed. Sarah was no longer alone, and the man whose life now depended on her care represented both a mystery and a test of everything she believed about courage, compassion, and the choices that defined who a person truly was. The warrior remained unconscious through the entire first day and into the second, his body fighting the combined effects of injuries, exhaustion, and fever. Sarah maintained a constant vigil, checking his breathing, changing bandages when they became soaked with blood or infection, and trying to get small amounts of water and broth into him during the brief moments when he seemed partially aware. She slept in fitful intervals, always alert for any change in his condition or any sound outside that might indicate his captors had tracked him to her homestead. On the morning of the third day, Sarah was preparing fresh bandages when she sensed a change in the room's atmosphere. Looking up, she found the warrior's eyes open and focused on her with an intensity that made her instinctively reach for the rifle she had kept within arm's reach. But the man made no threatening move, just watched her with dark eyes that showed confusion, pain, and careful assessment of his situation. He tried to speak, his voice rough and barely audible, words in a language Sarah could not understand, but which clearly carried questions about where he was and what had happened. Sarah set down the bandages and approached slowly, keeping her movements calm and non-threatening. She spoke in English, knowing he might not understand but hoping her tone would communicate that she meant no harm. She explained that she had found him collapsed at her gate 3 days ago, that she had brought him inside and tended his wounds, and that he was safe here for now. The warrior listened, his expression unreadable, and Sarah could see him processing not just her words, but the entire situation. Being cared for by a white woman, being vulnerable and injured in a stranger's home, having no clear memory of how he arrived here, After a long moment of silence, the warrior spoke again, this time in halting but clear English that surprised Sarah. He said his name was Tahatan, which meant hawk in his language, and he asked directly why she had helped him, when most settlers would have either left him to die or turned him over to authorities. Sarah considered her answer carefully, then replied with simple honesty, because leaving someone to suffer when you had the ability to help seemed wrong, regardless of who they were or where they came from. Tahatan's expression shifted slightly, perhaps registering surprise or respect, and he nodded slowly before exhaustion pulled him back toward unconsciousness. Over the following days, as Tahatan's strength gradually returned, a cautious communication developed between them. His English was limited but functional, learned during years of trading and occasional contact with settlers and soldiers. Sarah's complete lack of Shoshone meant their conversations were constrained to simple topics and concepts, but within those limitations, they began to build understanding. Tahatan explained, in fragments as his energy allowed, how he had been captured by bounty hunters who made money bringing in Native Americans to military authorities, dead or alive. He had escaped during transport, still bound, and had run blindly through the night until exhaustion and his injuries had finally overcome him. Sarah listened to his story with growing horror at the casual cruelty he described. The bounty hunters had beaten him not out of necessity, but seemingly for entertainment, treating him as less than human, an object to be delivered for payment, rather than a person with thoughts, feelings, and dignity. Tahatan spoke of it without self-pity, just factual recounting, but Sarah could hear the underlying anger and pain. She told him about her own story, her parents' death, her isolation on the homestead, and her decision to help him despite knowing it could bring trouble. Tahatan listened with the same careful attention he gave to everything, and Sarah sensed he was revising whatever assumptions he had made about white settlers based on his recent experiences. As Tahatan grew stronger and more mobile, the practical realities of their situation became more apparent. He could not stay indefinitely in Sarah's cabin without creating complications for both of them. If the bounty hunters tracked him here, Sarah could face accusations of harboring a fugitive. If Tahatan's own people found him here, they might misunderstand the situation and see Sarah as complicit in his capture. And the simple fact of a young white woman living alone with a Native American man, regardless of the innocent circumstances, would be viewed with suspicion and judgment by any settlers who discovered it. But neither of them raised these concerns directly at first, both seeming to understand that Tahatan needed more time to heal before facing the challenges of whatever came next. Instead, they fell into a domestic routine that felt strange and natural in equal measure. Sarah continued managing the homestead's daily requirements, while Tahatan gradually took on small tasks as his strength returned. Splitting wood one-handed while his injured arm healed, helping tend the garden in ways that showed sophisticated understanding of plants and growing, repairing tools and equipment with skills that impressed Sarah with their precision and effectiveness. Their conversations deepened as language barriers slowly diminished. Tahatan proved to be intelligent and observant, asking questions about Sarah's life and listening to her answers with genuine interest rather than just polite attention. He spoke about his own people, their traditions and beliefs, the changes that had been forced upon them as settlers, and the military pushed them into smaller territories, and his own role as a scout and hunter for his band. Sarah found herself fascinated by the picture he painted of a culture that was sophisticated and meaningful, completely contradicting the savage stereotypes she had been raised with. One evening, about 2 weeks after Sarah had found Tahatan at her gate, they sat outside the cabin watching the sun set over the sagebrush desert. The evening air was cool and pleasant, carrying the scent of juniper and the distant calls of coyotes beginning their nightly chorus. Tahatan had been quiet for some time, and Sarah sensed he was working up to saying something significant. Finally he spoke, telling Sarah that his injuries were healing well because of her skilled care, that he was growing strong enough to travel, and that he should leave soon before his presence brought her the trouble she had risked herself to help him avoid. Sarah felt a complicated mix of emotions at this announcement: relief that he was recovering, sadness at the thought of returning to solitude after these weeks of companionship, and fear about what would happen to him once he left. She asked where he would go, whether he could safely return to his people, or if the bounty hunters and military would simply capture him again. Tahatan admitted he did not know, that returning to his band might lead his enemies to them, but staying away meant abandoning his responsibilities to his community. It was an impossible situation with no good options, just varying degrees of risk and sacrifice. As they talked through the problem, Sarah found herself proposing something that surprised her, even as she voiced it. She suggested that Tahatan could stay on the homestead, working in exchange for shelter and food, presenting himself as a hired hand if anyone came by. It would provide him with safety while he fully recovered and figured out his next steps, and it would give Sarah help she genuinely needed with the harder physical labor of maintaining the property. The arrangement could continue until a better solution presented itself, or until circumstances changed in ways that made it untenable. Tahatan looked at Sarah with an expression that mixed gratitude, concern, and something that might have been respect. He pointed out that such an arrangement would create exactly the kind of talk and suspicion that could damage Sarah's reputation and standing in the settler community. A young unmarried woman living with a Native American man would be seen as scandalous at best and dangerous at worst, regardless of the actual innocent nature of their relationship. He did not want to repay her kindness by creating problems that would follow her long. After he was gone, Sarah acknowledged the truth of his concerns but argued that her reputation mattered less than doing what she believed was right. She had already committed herself to helping Tahatan when she brought him into her cabin, and she was not going to abandon that commitment now just because it might be socially complicated. She pointed out that she had already been living outside conventional expectations since her parents died, maintaining a homestead alone when young women were supposed to seek male protection and guidance. Adding one more unconventional choice to that list seemed consistent rather than radical. The conversation continued as stars emerged in the darkening sky, both of them exploring the implications and possibilities of Sarah's proposal. They discussed practical matters, how to explain Tahatan's presence if neighbors visited, what work would be most useful, how to maintain propriety in their living arrangements. But underneath the practical planning was a deeper acknowledgement of the trust and respect that had developed between them during these weeks of recovery and conversation. They had become something more than just rescuer and rescued, more than temporary cohabitants of a cabin. They had become partners in navigating an impossible situation, and friends who saw past cultural differences to the human beings beneath. The arrangement between Sarah and Tahatan evolved over the following months into a genuine partnership that worked far better than either had anticipated. Tahatan proved to be an invaluable help on the homestead, his knowledge of the land and practical skills complementing Sarah's determined but sometimes limited experience. He taught her techniques for finding water sources, identifying edible and medicinal plants, and reading weather signs that could mean the difference between preparedness and disaster. Sarah shared what her parents had taught her about farming, animal husbandry, and the various skills required to survive on an isolated frontier homestead. Their communication improved dramatically as both worked to bridge the language gap. Tahatan's English became more fluent and natural, while Sarah learned basic Shoshone words and phrases that allowed her to express simple concepts and understand when Tahatan slipped into his native language during moments of frustration or when English words failed to capture what he wanted to convey. They developed their own mixed vocabulary, a combination of both languages plus gestures and expressions that became their private communication system, comfortable and efficient in ways that formal language often was not. The homestead itself prospered under their combined efforts. The garden produced more abundantly than it had in years, benefiting from Tahatan's knowledge of companion planting and traditional growing techniques. The cabin underwent repairs and improvements that made it more weatherproof and comfortable. They built a proper smokehouse for preserving meat, improved the corral and barn, and even began constructing a small addition to the cabin that would provide Tahatan with separate sleeping quarters, maintaining the propriety that both recognized as important for protecting Sarah's reputation if questioned, but their partnership extended beyond practical cooperation into genuine friendship, built on mutual respect and growing understanding. They spent evenings by the fire sharing stories from their different backgrounds, and Sarah was fascinated by the richness and complexity of Shoshone culture that Tahatan described. He spoke of creation stories and spiritual beliefs, of social structures and governance systems that were far more sophisticated than the primitive stereotypes Sarah had been taught. He described art, music, and traditions that reflected deep connection to the land and philosophical understanding of humanity's place in the natural world. Sarah reciprocated by sharing her own upbringing, the books her mother had taught her to read, the dreams her parents had held for building something lasting on the frontier, and her own complicated feelings about the settler culture she belonged to, but increasingly questioned. She admitted that her education had included many assumptions about Native Americans that she now recognized as propaganda, designed to justify displacement and violence. Tahatan appreciated her honesty and her willingness to examine beliefs rather than defending them reflexively. A quality he noted was rare in his experience with white settlers. The first real test of their arrangement came when a neighboring rancher named Thomas Brennan rode by the homestead on his way to town. Brennan had been friendly with Sarah's father and had checked on Sarah a few times since her parents died, expressing concern about her living alone. When he arrived and saw Tahatan working in the corral, his expression shifted to shock and suspicion. Brennan dismounted and approached Sarah with barely concealed alarm, asking pointed questions about who this Indian was, what he was doing on her property, and whether Sarah was being held against her will or threatened in any way. Sarah handled the confrontation with a calm confidence that surprised even herself. She introduced Tahatan as a hired hand who was helping with work too heavy for her to manage alone, explained that he had been traveling through when illness had struck him, and she had offered him work in exchange for care, and asked Brennan directly if he found anything concerning about a young woman hiring help to maintain her property. Brennan seemed somewhat mollified by Sarah's matter-of-fact explanation, though his expression remained skeptical. He warned Sarah that others might not be as understanding, that harboring an Indian could bring trouble from authorities, or from settlers who viewed all Native Americans as threats. Sarah thanked Brennan for his concern, but firmly stated that she was making her own decisions about how to manage her property and who to employ. She pointed out that Tahatan had proven himself to be reliable, skilled and honorable in the months he had been working for her, which was more than could be said for some of the white drifters who had knocked on her door looking for work or handouts. Brennan left looking troubled but not openly hostile, and Sarah knew that word would spread quickly through the sparse settler community about the unusual situation at the Mitchell homestead. The consequences of Brennan's visit arrived within weeks. The territorial marshal, a man named William Carter, rode to the homestead to investigate reports of a suspicious Native American living on Sarah's property. Carter was professional but firm, explaining that he needed to verify Tahatan's identity and ensure he was not a fugitive or a threat to settler safety. The interview was tense, with Carter asking detailed questions about where Tahatan came from, why he was not on reservation land where Native Americans were supposed to be confined, and whether he had proper documentation of his status. Tahatan answered carefully, acknowledging that he was Shoshone, but claiming to be from a band that had permission to live and work in the territory under certain conditions. It was a carefully constructed story that was not entirely false, but which obscured the specific circumstances of his arrival at Sarah's homestead. Carter was not fully satisfied, but ultimately had no legal basis to remove Tahatan, especially since Sarah insisted he was there voluntarily as an employee and that she had no complaints about his presence or behavior. The marshal warned them both that he would be checking periodically and that any trouble or complaints would result in immediate action. After Carter left, Sarah and Tahatan sat in the cabin, discussing the close call and what it meant for their future. They both understood that they were living on borrowed time, that the arrangement that had worked so well for them was unsustainable long-term in a society that viewed their partnership with suspicion and disapproval. Tahatan raised again the possibility that he should leave, return to his people, or strike out for territory where his presence would attract less attention. But Sarah argued against this, pointing out that his contributions to the homestead were genuine and valuable, that they had built something meaningful together, and that she was unwilling to abandon their partnership simply because others found it uncomfortable. Their conversation revealed feelings that had been developing unspoken beneath the surface of their practical partnership. Tahatan admitted that working with Sarah had given him a sense of purpose and belonging that he had lost when separated from his tribe, that her courage and kindness had restored his faith that understanding between their peoples was possible. Sarah confessed that Tahatan's presence had transformed her lonely struggle into something that felt like genuine partnership and friendship, that she had come to value his perspective and companionship beyond just the practical help he provided. As autumn approached and the Wyoming landscape began its transition toward winter, Sarah and Tahatan worked together to prepare the homestead for the cold months ahead. They harvested the garden, stored food, cut and stacked firewood, and made repairs to ensure the cabin and outbuildings could withstand heavy snow and freezing temperatures. The work created a rhythm and intimacy that felt like family, two people relying on each other and building something together that neither could have achieved alone. One evening, as the first snow of the season began to fall softly outside the cabin windows, Tahatan told Sarah a story from his people about the hawk and the sage hen, two very different birds who learned to respect each other's strengths and became partners in surviving a harsh winter. The story was a parable about cooperation across differences, and Sarah understood that Tahatan was speaking not just about ancient birds but about them, about what they had built together despite coming from worlds that were supposed to be enemies. She reached across the space between them and took his hand, a gesture that acknowledged everything they had not said directly, but which they both understood perfectly. Winter arrived in full force, bringing the kind of heavy snows and bitter cold that tested even the most prepared homesteaders. Sarah and Tahatan found themselves confined to the cabin and immediate surroundings for days at a time, dependent on the preparations they had made during autumn and on each other's company to survive the isolation. The forced proximity deepened their connection, transforming their partnership into something neither had fully anticipated but which felt natural and inevitable given everything they had shared. Their conversations during those long winter evenings ranged across every topic imaginable. Tahatan described his childhood and education within his tribe, the skills and knowledge that had been passed down through generations, and the profound connection to land and ancestors that defined Shoshone identity. Sarah shared her own upbringing, the books and ideas that had shaped her thinking, and her growing belief that the frontier's promise of freedom and opportunity had come at a terrible cost to the people who had lived here first. They debated philosophy, shared dreams about possible futures, and gradually admitted feelings that went beyond friendship into territory that was complicated by every external circumstance, but undeniable in its authenticity. Tahatan was the first to speak directly about what was happening between them. One snowy February evening, as they sat by the fire, he told Sarah that he had not intended to develop romantic feelings for her, that such a connection between their peoples was fraught with difficulties that might prove insurmountable. But he also said that denying what he felt would be dishonest, and that Sarah deserved to know that his reasons for staying had evolved beyond gratitude or practical convenience into genuine affection and respect that went deeper than any relationship he had experienced before losing his family years ago. Sarah listened to Tahatan's careful words with her heart pounding, recognizing her own feelings reflected in his confession. She admitted that she had been falling in love with him gradually over the months they had worked together, that she had tried to ignore or rationalize these feelings because acknowledging them meant confronting all the social barriers and potential consequences. But she also said that she was tired of making decisions based on fear of what others might think or say, that her parents had taught her to value character over convention, and that Tahatan's honor, kindness, and integrity mattered more than the arbitrary divisions that society tried to enforce. They talked long into the night about what a genuine relationship between them would mean. Both understood the challenges. Sarah would be ostracized by much of the settler community. Tahatan would be viewed with even greater suspicion and hostility, and any children they might have would belong fully to neither world, carrying the complicated legacy of mixed heritage in a time when such unions were discouraged or forbidden. But they also recognized that they had already been living outside conventional boundaries, that their partnership had proven stronger and more meaningful than either had known was possible, and that choosing each other might be difficult, but choosing safety through separation would be a betrayal of everything they had built together, say. Winter gradually released its grip, and spring began to emerge across the Wyoming landscape. Sarah and Tahatan made their decision official in the only way that felt true to both their backgrounds. They held a private ceremony that honored both Shoshone traditions and Sarah's Christian upbringing, exchanging vows that committed them to each other regardless of what the outside world thought or said. There was no legal recognition, no official record, but the promises they made felt more binding and significant than any government document could have been. The response from the settler community, when word inevitably spread, was mixed and largely negative. Thomas Brennan and several other neighbors stopped visiting entirely, making clear their disapproval of Sarah's choices. Marshall Carter returned to investigate whether Sarah was being coerced or manipulated, and seemed genuinely troubled when Sarah insisted that her relationship with Tahatan was entirely voluntary and based on genuine affection and respect. A few settlers muttered about calling for Tahatan's removal or arrest, but none followed through, perhaps deterred by Sarah's fierce defense of her husband and her detailed documentation of his legitimate presence on her property. But not all reactions were hostile. An elderly woman named Margaret Hollis, who had lived on the frontier for decades and seen much that challenged simple categorizations, visited the homestead and spoke privately with both Sarah and Tahatan. Mrs. Hollis told them that she admired their courage in choosing authentic connection over social approval, that the frontier was still wild enough to allow for unconventional arrangements if people had the strength to defend their choices. She offered friendship and periodic visits, becoming an unexpected ally who provided connection to the wider community without requiring Sarah and Tahatan to compromise who they were. As spring turned to summer and then autumn again, Sarah and Tahatan's life together settled into routines that felt like genuine home and family. The homestead continued to prosper, their combined skills making them more successful than most single-family operations in the area. They made plans for expansion, discussed the possibility of children, and built a life that honored both their backgrounds while creating something new that belonged uniquely to them. Tahatan maintained occasional contact with his tribal community through carefully arranged meetings in remote locations, and he was eventually able to convey to his people that he was alive, safe, and living by choice with a woman who understood and respected his culture. The response was complicated, with some expressing disappointment that he had not returned and others acknowledging that the old ways of life were changing, and that survival sometimes meant adapting in unexpected directions. His mother sent a gift through intermediaries, a beautifully beaded pouch that signaled her acceptance if not full approval of his choices. Years later, when Wyoming had evolved from rough frontier territory to more settled state, Sarah and Tahatan's story would be remembered as one of the unusual partnerships that had existed in the spaces between cultures. They raised 3 children who grew up speaking both English and Shoshone, learning traditions from both backgrounds and navigating the complex identity of being neither fully white nor fully Native American, but something new that carried the best elements of both worlds. The children faced challenges and prejudices, but they also had the foundation of parents who had chosen love over fear, and who taught them that identity was about character and values rather than rigid categories. Sarah and Tahatan never regretted their choice, though they acknowledged it had not been easy, and that they had paid social costs for their unconventional relationship. But they also knew that the alternative, living apart or denying their feelings to satisfy others' expectations, would have been a form of death, a surrender of authenticity and connection that would have diminished them both. They had taken the harder path, but it was their path, chosen freely and walked together with courage and commitment. On quiet evenings, they would sometimes sit outside as they had that first night, when Tahatan had acknowledged his feelings, watching the sun set over the sagebrush desert and listening for the drums that occasionally still echoed across the landscape. Those drums no longer made Sarah fearful or uncertain. Instead, they reminded her of the night that had changed her life, when she had chosen to answer suffering with compassion, and had discovered that sometimes the most profound connections come from the most unexpected encounters. She had heard drums in the desert and found not danger but the person who would become her partner. Her love and her family, proving that courage and openness could create bridges across any divide, if people were willing to see past fear to the shared humanity that united all people regardless of the surface differences that too often kept them apart.